Good afternoon. Welcome to our latest climate discussion. This week we're going to focus on a Capital Weather Gang article that came out earlier this week about the activity of hurricanes and whether or not we've seen an increase in the activity. So definitely it's a free article, so definitely check it out. The Washington Post always produces some very interesting content, and I want to first give some props to the actual article first. So definitely check it out. It's under New Climate Normal for Atlantic Hurricanes Show More Frequency and Intense Storms. Well, okay, so let me break down some of this data. What I decided to do is do this crazy thing, like break down the data myself and take a look and see what exactly is happening. And you can get a lot of this data from the HRDAT Reanalysis, Hurricane Research Division. You can get a ton of data on all this. You can actually dive into yourself and take a look at it. It's really, really great stuff. So if you're into that type of research and you want to see how they come about some of these numbers, it's a really good way to learn about climatology and understand what's going on in the tropics. Now, I could pull up all sorts of articles here, and all not articles, but a lot of discussions and a lot of research for and against this headline. Okay? But there's more to this discussion, and they mentioned some of the factors here that would support the fact that we're seeing more hurricanes in the Atlantic. Now, clearly, we've been more active of late. So what I decided to do is this crazy thing called looking at the data myself. So I went from 1901 all the way down so we had a little error there. Sorry about that. Okay, so back to it. I went back and I did some of this data analysis. And I went from 1901 all the way to today. In fact, here, let me move me out of here so that way you could see it clearly. And you could see all the way down to 2020 and got all the data. And it produced this chart. Okay, so it looks like, yeah, look, see, we're seeing more activity. The rate of major hurricanes, not really all that impressive. Went through with the decadal data. Again, we went from 1901 to 1910, and then we went all the way to 2020. And notice we've actually seen a drop in the 2011-2020 time period down to 3.1 major hurricanes. So not exactly shown as a steady increase, but if you look at this, clearly we're seeing more storms. So, is this all climate driven? Is all of this because of your SUV or because you're using carbon dioxide? Far more complicated than that. Let's look at some of the factors that really contributed. Now, they actually mentioned this in one of them, which is the increase in our use of observations. Up to about 1960, right about here, we really had a hard time picking up a lot of our tropical systems. In fact, 1960, the start of using satellite pictures, gave us the ability to see hurricanes develop way out in the Atlantic that could possibly pass or miss a lot of the shipping lanes, which was where we were getting a lot of our data before the 1960s. In fact, take a look at here, the 1910s, we had a lot of storms with just 5, but that was whatever impacted us. If it didn't hit a shipping lane or didn't hit land, it didn't exist. So you had a relatively slow start, but even in the 1930s and 40s, we got pretty active. In some cases, we had some of our most active periods. I'm going to take a look at in the 1930s, some very active periods. In fact, the 1930s stood alone all the way until we got into the 1990s. So up until the 1990s, we didn't see the type of activity that we saw like what we did around 1932. So, or should I say 1933? So, what does this tell us? Well, we know that we missed a lot of storms in the 1930s, and there's potential that we could have missed more. But also with the lack of satellite data, we also at times under forecasted or under observed the strength of these storms. Whereas now we have drones, we have observations, ships, planes flying into the storms, so we can get a far more accurate read of how strong these hurricanes are. So that's a factor too. And to Capital's credit, they did mention that in the article. But one thing I looked high and low that they did not mention is a major change that happened right around here. And right around 2002 is when we started to see a very noticeable increase in the amount of hurricanes and named tropical systems that were forming. Do you guys know what that could have been? I'll give you a hint. It's called the subtropical storm. Before 2002, when you had a subtropical storm, it was not named, it was barely covered, you barely heard anything about it, and most of the time they just considered it as an extratropical storm. They didn't give any type of analysis, and if you had a warm core low within the cold core structure, they just called it a hybrid storm. So we weren't really diving into the observations of whether or not it was actually a pure warm core low within a cold core structure and how strong that storm actually was. So there was a lot of data missing before 2002, and especially before the 1930s, of how many of these storms actually existed and what actually was the real strength of these storms. So now we have included that. And so that is how you end up with this type of 30-year average. See, when you fundamentally changed the observations and the definitions of naming a tropical system, naturally you're going to get a greater increase in your amount of named storms and also potential hurricanes. So that is what you're seeing here. It's not that the climate, which again, there are clear indications that climate is starting to influence tropical systems. I'll name a couple. Okay, so for example, when you have enhanced precipitable water values pushing all the way up into the northern mid-Atlantic or into New England, we're talking about precipitable water values around 2-3 inches, at times 4 inches. That's because you have a warmer atmosphere overall, and so you can hold more water. That's an example. Another one could be that you develop a higher potential for high latitude blocking, which in theory could slow down a storm, which in theory could lead to a more widespread flash flooding event like what we saw in Texas. That could be a climate factor. But the increase in storms is more due to, in my opinion, due to the fact that we've actually changed the definition of what we're naming. So, and that's not mentioned anywhere at all, unfortunately, in this article. And it's kind of misleading too. Climate norms. Well, let's be honest here. The climate norm, was it normal for us to name subtropical storms or not? If we should have done it, then we need to go back, if we can, and find out whether that extratropical storm was actually a subtropical storm and then add it onto the list to get a real clear idea of how many storms. When we take a look at the data here, or yearly data of how many subtropical storms actually existed, if possible, in the 1910s. 1920s. You're more likely to find that in 1930s. Look, you had 20 storms occur. How many of those could be added that were subtropical, which would blow your curve out of the water? And by the way, 6 major storms. You had another season too, 1950. 16 storms, 11 hurricanes, 6 major hurricanes. So yeah, you can have a lot of examples here. And then you go down here, yeah, we've had 2 major hurricanes, but again, 2 seasons where we had 6 or more. In 2005, we had 7, 6 in 2004. But that's not unusual compared to when we look at the data set during active years. 5, 6, 6. Again, some years 4, 3, 6. So you've had plenty of years in the past where we were over 3 during active seasons. So to say that we're seeing more frequency of major hurricanes, a little bit questionable. You could make the argument based on the raw data that, yeah, we're seeing an increase, but we also are seeing years where we have none in the same type of enhanced environment. As far as the number of storms, especially getting up to 31 here, look, guys, we weren't doing that until we got to 2002. Until once we started naming subtropical storms, every season since then has been at or above normal for our average. So you're comparing an average from years before with 2 different definitions of what we're using to name the storms. So that's where we are right now. I would call the article slightly misleading. They should have mentioned that, and they should have put that in their discussion. That's where I stand on that. Have a wonderful day, and as always, stay safe out there.